going to take a look at the video, and I'm going to pause it to give my opinion on the video at different times.
So one of my favorite movies of all time, man, is Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained. Samuel L. Jackson plays one of the greatest characters in movie history. He plays an Uncle Tom house Negro. And Uncle Tom house Negroes were incredibly hated among the other slaves because basically they sold out their own race for the white man. Well, I have bad news for you, black Christians. Basically, every one of you are Uncle Tom house Negroes.
Okay, I definitely agree with him.
Let me say, because I watched this the first time I recorded it, I got to add, I agree what he says about house Negroes being despised. I definitely don't agree that all Christians are house Negroes.
You all know about house Negroes and the extra, can't even say privilege, but how they were treated, or how they thought they were better than the Negroes that worked in the field. And I agree with him on that. So I just wanted to add that.
It's true, I'm sorry, you may not like it, but the truth is the truth. And I'm going to tell you a story, a true story. A little over 400 years ago, the first slave ship came to America with African slaves on it. And it was called the Good Ship Jesus. Go look it up, it's true.
I agree with him. Without having to look it up, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the name of the ship. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not surprised at the fake missionaries, because historically we know that it's accurate. We see it today that people use religion. People use anything, but people use religion to further their own interests. Wolves in sheep's clothing, as the Bible puts it, which doesn't disqualify Christianity right there, because the Bible says that there will be people that will do that. And further proof is that's more of an indictment against the wickedness of man than Christianity or any particular religion. Think about Hurricane Katrina. Think about the tsunami in Indonesia. Like any disaster that we've had people out in the street, imposters posing to work for like Red Cross or whatever, claiming to accept money for victims of these tragedies, but they were pocketing money. Like, you got Ponzi schemes, you got pyramid schemes, you have all kind of things that people use and abuse for their own good or for their own best interest. And you just think of like a baseball bat. A baseball bat is intended for baseball, but yet people will use a baseball bat to assault somebody. A car is designed to get you from point A to point B, but a jealous wife or a psychopath or whatever will use a car to run someone over. That doesn't automatically discredit the validity or the resourcefulness of the item that's being used. But anyway, that's not even the main topic here, but I just wanted to add that in because you can just tell by his intent what he's trying to imply.
This is history, man. The Good Ship Jesus was the first to bring African slaves over here, but it was not the last, and many other ships followed. And those of your ancestors who were lucky enough to actually make it over here, when they were tortured and raped and murdered, some of them tortured and murdered in front of the others just to make an example about what happens to you if you fight back. Their families were torn apart, never to see each other again, and then they were put some of the most back-breaking labor day after day the mind could possibly imagine to their bodies gave out.
Again, of course, I agree with him. We know that historically, we know how terrible slavery was, and it was probably even worse than what could be put into words. 20-hour-a-day work, being stripped of your identity, your name, having your family taken from you, being put on the auction block naked for people to poke and pry and inspect you. We all know about I agree with that wholeheartedly. It was disastrous, and it was done by people who portrayed to be God-fearing, Bible-loving Christians. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
And believe it or not, there were actually a few people back then that said, hey, this is a bad idea. We should not enslave our fellow human beings. But the slave masters said we have a right to do this. We have a religious right. Because the Bible tells us it's a...
All right, before he gets into the Bible, which is like the main subject here, notice what he does. He says the first slave ships were named Jesus something. Basically, Christian, so-called Christian missionaries, they brought about slavery in the United States, which is correct. Then he goes on to say that there were people that opposed slavery. He's creating a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is when someone presents you two options or two types of something when there's more than two. He gives you Christians and those who oppose slavery. That's a false dichotomy. There is more than just those two kind of people that existed. There are Christians who were so-called Christians who were for slavery. There were people that were against slavery. But looking at back in that time, everyone was pretty much religious. That was like the general. It was a religious culture. So what he should be saying is there were Christians who were for slavery and there were Christians who were against slavery. But he won't say that. He doesn't say that. And I don't know if that's subconscious or intentional, but that's certainly a false dichotomy. One thing is, when you listen to people talk, if you know the laws of logic, and there are a couple of them, non-contradiction, that's probably the simplest one that you'll notice right off the bat. Something can't be what it is not. The law of identity, something is what it is and not what it's not. I mean, like, very basic things that you can't have a comprehensive conversation without following these laws. And if you know them and you just listen to people talk, you can kind of notice the logical fallacies that they make as they go along. That doesn't automatically disprove their point, but you can kind of see, it'll kind of help you to understand why people can go astray with certain things, and not just with religious topics, just in conversation in general. So anyway, he created a false dichotomy.
Okay, to elaborate a little bit further, I'm going to go to the website, Black and White Dualism. Wait, this is not the right thing. Sorry about that. Okay, false dilemma. I called it a false dichotomy. It's also called a false dilemma. It's like black and white thinking when there is a gray. He presents the black and white. Well, pardon the pun, but he portrays the white as the Christians, the evil slave master Christians, and then the other side there's those who oppose them. So he lumps Christianity and slave masters all together, and everyone else completely separate. When actually both sides were Christian. Both sides were Christian, but he doesn't paint it that way. He makes a false dichotomy. I hope that I'm trying to explain it a little bit better. So I hope that makes sense. Let's go back to the video.
Christians or Christianity credit for anything, and because he's against it, he's anti-Christian. But anyway, just keep that in mind as you read this. He created a false dichotomy right there. He gave the impression that there were evil Christian slave masters, and then there were others as in people who were opposed to them, and that's how you demonize one group of people by dividing them like that when it ought not be. He should say there were Christians who were against slavery and Christians who were for it.
Okay, and then they opened this book of ancient fairy tales and they read from it proof that their religion gave them every right to hold slaves. Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. However,
now listen, okay, now listen to this. He said, this ancient book of fairy tales. Now, when you go through this, when you watch this video, and people do this all the time, I never understood it. If the Bible is false, if it's made up, if it's not from God, why is it that these people who criticize it will discount certain things, but they'll cling to other things. Now he's about to quote some biblical scriptures, and we'll go over those. But people, I never understood that. For example, they'll say, "Oh, God didn't create the world in 7 days," or "I don't believe, that Moses crossed the Israelites crossed the Red Sea or Dead Sea, that kind of thing." And they don't have to believe that, but let them find something that they think hurts the case for Christianity. Oh, no! This really happened. It says it right here, and this really happened. How come this guy doesn't read the Bible and consistently disagrees with everything? Why doesn't he doubt everything? He'll say, like, the creation story, or Jesus walking on water, or any of the stuff that's good. He'll say didn't happen. I don't agree with it. It's nonsense. It's fairy tales. But then when you get to something bad, like the Israelites, let's say it, for example, it said, Jesus cussed somewhere. He would turn it in and say, "Well, Jesus cussed. He's not holy." But he won't think, "Well, this is a book of fairy tales. Jesus didn't really cuss." So that's just a thought that's something I noticed with pretty much everyone who criticizes the Bible. They're not consistent. But anyway, let's get to the scriptures.
You may purchase male or female slaves from among the foreigners who live among you.
I'm going to rewind it a little
Spoke
bit.
of ancient fairy tales, and they read from it. Proof that their religion gave them every right to hold slaves. Leviticus 25:44 through 46. However, you may purchase male or female slaves from among the foreigners who live among you. You may also purchase the children of such resident foreigners, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, pass them on to your children, and have a permanent inheritance. You may treat your slaves like this, but the people of Israel, your relatives, you must never treat this way. For how long?
All right, hold on. Leviticus 25:44 to 46. All right. I paused it to read the scripture and to pull it up. And here is Leviticus 25. This is Bible Gateway, by the way. We got Leviticus 25, and let's read it in context. You don't want to just read. You don't want to read the scripture or any kind of literature, really, whether it's poetry or a medical journal. You don't read literature by just reading an excerpt out the middle. That's just that's a poor reading practice. But anyway, unfortunately, when it comes to religious texts, whether the Bible, the Quran, or even our law, people tend to do that. They pull out excerpts and they kind of cut away the context. Anyway, his quotation was accurate. Where is it at? 45, 44. He read it properly. So let's start from the beginning. Leviticus 25. In the beginning, I'm just going to give you a summary of you see the subtitles there, so I'll just give you a summary of it. This Sabbatic year and the year of Jubilee. Now, basically, what God said was the people need to give the land a year to rest from growing crops and stuff, which is why now, even in our country, they'll rotate crops to give it a break from the particular thing that they're growing. So in the beginning part, it talks about everyone in the year of Jubilee, everyone will go back to their own land and they would trade with each other fairly since they're giving their crops a break. And he's like, well, you'll buy and you'll trade with each other to survive during that time. And what he's saying is, treat each other honestly. So he's laying down the rules for that. Now, the second section of Leviticus 25 is the law of redemption. Basically, what this is God made some laws so that if an Israelite lost his land, that he could get it back. And he had a certain amount of time. I believe it's a year. If you go back and read this, it's about a year. And he has about a year to get his property back for the same price. And basically, what it is if he doesn't have the money to get it back, a family member can purchase his property for him. And basically what this is saying is that when a person goes to buy their land back, they are not supposed to be taken advantage of. And, oh, well, you bought it, you sold it because you were poor, and we bought it. Now I'm going to sell it back to you for 10 times as much. No, they're supposed to sell it back for the same amount. So that's what the second part is about. The third section of Leviticus 25 is it talks about when a fellow Israelite becomes poor for whatever reason. And it says, now in the case of a countryman, starting in verse 35, in the case of a countryman of yours becomes poor and his means with regard to you falter, that you are to sustain him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Now, what does that mean? Why does he say that? If your fellow brother becomes poor, or he becomes like if he can't pay something that he owes you, you are to sustain him like a stranger or a sojourner. Sojourner is like a traveler. A stranger will be someone who's not from there but who's staying there. A sojourner is like someone going through but they're staying for rest or what injury or whatever. This implies that strangers and sojourners were to be supported by the people. Matter of fact, if you go back to the beginning where it talks about the sabbatical year, it talks about that. Strangers and sojourners, people who were not Israelites, were to be supported by them. So now this is talking about people that actually live with you. Your own people, fellow Israelites. Do not take usurious interest from him in verse 36, but revere your God that your countrymen may live with you. Do not take usurious interest. Don't support him and then again take advantage of him and say, oh, I want 150% of what I gave you when you were down and out. These are good, just laws right here. And then we're going to get down to the whole slavery thing. But think about what you're seeing right here. And I want you to make note of that he didn't mention any of this. You may say he didn't mention any of this because it's not relevant to his the message that he's trying to portray or whatever. But the reason why he doesn't mention any of this is because he's trying to paint a picture of the Bible being evil. And what you're reading is God giving rules for fair and just treatment of one another and the land. And then it goes down into slaves. So just keep that in mind. In the context of Leviticus 25, you're getting the laws. You're getting laws about how to treat each other in terms of business and financial, just business and land, how to treat the land. So anyway, where we at? 39. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave service. Now, so here you go. This goes right into how people become slaves in back in Israeli times, during the time that this was written. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, and that is why back then why people would have slaves. Now, he's going to mention another scripture, and I'll go into what slave actually means, or at least what it meant in the context of that day. That's a better scripture to explain it. But I'm just going to continue to go through this. So people, for whatever reason, I don't know, mismanagement of their money, I don't know. For whatever reason, they become poor. They'll sell themselves out, and they'll do the same thing for their children. They'll sell their children out and say, well, hey, we'll work for you for, until the debt's paid, a certain amount of time we'll work for you. And there's actually a way to keep people out of prison. Well, they didn't have prison then, but that's actually a way to keep, if a person can do this kind of thing, it's very unfortunate, but if a person can actually, let's say can you imagine if you owed PICO, or if you owed your mortgage company money, if you could just spend your weekends, like let's say you fall behind on your payments, and instead of accruing all this interest, if you can go and work for them on the weekends, and they'll take off money off of what you owe, that'd be pretty cool. Now, unfortunately, there's no guarantee in how they would treat you. So, which is why God lays down the law of when a person does this, how are you supposed to treat them? Because if you look at our system now, and I'm not saying that we should have slavery, I'm not, before anyone thinks it in their mind. By the way, we do have slavery, it's the prison system. But anyway, that's something totally different. But just idea right here, not the whole bottom part about slavery. We'll get into that. But just think about what he's saying. He's giving people a way to redeem themselves without. He's giving people a way to work off their debt. Now, if we could work off our debt today with our debtors, that would keep us from being in such a bad hole. Like think about there are people that they can't buy a house because of something they did 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or their spouse did. They didn't even deal with their spouse or their mate that used their information and they let them put stuff in their name, whatever. Anyway, that idea in itself is pretty cool. Now, verse 40. Let's go back to 39. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave's service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he was a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Now, so here you see a distinction between this person that's paying himself out of debt or working himself out of debt, and then a slave. The slave service is, as you go down to the next verses, a slave service would be a slave of a non-Israelite. It will be longer than until a debt is paid. So let's continue reading. Verse 41, he shall go out from you, he and his sons with him, and shall go back to his family, that he may return to the property of his forefathers. For they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They are not to be sold in a slave sale. So basically, if a person comes to you and says, "Hey, I'll $10,000 or whatever they used back then," they used primarily crops, but I owe you X amount. I'm going to come and work for you and work in your fields to pay off that debt. So you couldn't take that person and then go sell him to somebody else to work for life and try to make money off of it. You're supposed to deal with him justly and fairly and let him work off that debt. Okay? So, verse 43. You shall not rule over him with severity, but are to revere your God. What does that mean? And why does God put them together? Because what he's saying is, you need to treat him properly. You are not to treat him improperly or severely, but are to revere your God. It's a contrast. It implies that if you do treat him severely, you're not revering God. And what does that mean, to revere God? To honor God, to respect God, to acknowledge him by your treatment of this servant. You are acknowledging God or not acknowledging God. Keep that in mind. Verse 44. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. Then too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land. They may also become your possession. That's verse 45. Okay, so what he's saying is, you can have slaves. You will, as for your male and female slaves, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations around you. A fellow Israelite, like the guy said in the video, is not to be a slave, but you can have slaves from the nations around you. Now, the next passage, the next scripture, we're not done here, but the next scripture he goes through, I'll deal with that and what that means. But anyway, what does he say? How do you get these slaves? Do you go steal them from a field? Do you go to someone like he compares this to the beginning of slavery in America. Now, let me ask you this. When you read verse 45, then it is too out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land, they may also become your possession. How do you get them? Buy them. Who do you buy them from? Family. Now, the idea is, if you go back up and look earlier, in verse 39, if if a countryman of yours becomes so poor in regard to you that he sells himself to you. So you have a reason why people have slaves. They go into debt where they don't have a way to support themselves. And particularly people that are not from there. Number one. Number two, if you understand biblically the land that God gave Israel, which is like pretty much the best land in the world, which is why today they still fight over it. It was the best land in the world. So people will come here. I want to live among the Israelites. They will come there because of that land. And, well, guess what? Just like in the gold rush, like in the United States, people would move across country, then they had nothing. All they had was what they had with them. So this was a way that they were able to support themselves. They would sell themselves or their relatives into slavery. And again, I want you to, I'm not avoiding the word slavery or slave. We're going to get into that in the next passage of what slave actually means. I just want to point out how these people come to be slaves. Now, over history, people have become slaves because of war. Alexander the Great had slaves. Israel had slaves at various times. Israel went out into slavery themselves. They were enslaved, like it seems like every other book of the Bible. They were enslaved by the Moabites or the various different nations that God used against them to discipline. So slavery did not originate here. And they were slaves in Egypt, which we'll look at in the Exodus verses that he'll bring up. So they didn't invent slavery. God allowed slavery. He gave them stipulations for slavery. And as you can see already, just looking at what happens when your fellow man becomes a slave, or your fellow man is not to become a slave. You are to treat him justly and let him work off his debt. And you can't sell them. Now the foreigners who are in the countries around you or the people that are among you, you can acquire slaves. But who do you buy them from? Their family. So that's the first difference between this. That's the first difference between what happened in this country and the slavery that was in biblical times, as he's referring to. In Africa, when the fake missionaries came over to get slaves, do you think these people gave over their family and their relatives to slavery? No, they sold out their relatives. The tribes that they were warring with, their enemies. They turned them over. They're not going to give away their family. Now, why would a person give away their family? Because in the land, as you live among these people, you are deciding who you would sell your relatives to. You know what I mean? Like, it's like you have control over it. There's nobody just coming and snatching them and taking.
By relative, I mean children. Yeah, you can't sell your cousin or your uncle. It's referring to your children. And again, the idea is that you would sell your children to basically be indentured servants, or they would be slaves because it would be for life. But the idea is that when you go into a land, and we'll see when we get to the other passages, when you go into a land, there ought not be anyone homeless there because everyone is accounted for. And when we go look at the Exodus passages, it'll talk about the treatment of the quote-unquote slaves that you have and how you ought to treat them. And what you're looking at, if the way that this is described biblically, if this was applied anywhere, first of all, it would disqualify what happened to the United States. And this actually goes against what happened in the United States when you look at how people were treated and why people came to be quote-unquote slaves. But what you're looking at, if this is implemented and the following passages that talk about how they ought to be treated, you would not have one homeless person in this society, theoretically. And you would not have innocent young girls being snatched off the street and put into the sex trade because they would have an owner or a husband and not just left in an agricultural society with no land trying to make it on their own. How would they make it on their own? They only have one thing to offer. They don't have land. They wouldn't have land, and they would have to hire themselves out or worse. So what you're seeing here is a good structure for people to get out of debt, and then also a society that doesn't have any leeches. Everyone here, whether it's by them having their own property or rather them quote unquote selling themselves out in a less ideal way, but every person in this society will be contributing to something. So keep that in mind.
You're actually in control. He doesn't say you can take them from the people around you. You can buy them. You can acquire them. So anyway, that still seems, I know to a lot of people kind of crazy because the whole idea of slavery, when you think of slavery, you just picture people getting whipped and terrible stuff. Terrible stuff. All of this is unfortunate anyway. But for anybody to be in this position is just terrible. It just ruins your family. But anyway, I would imagine it would ruin your family. So anyway, verse 26, you may bequeath them to your sons after you to receive a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. So what he's saying is you may bequeath them. You may allow your sons to take them on after you die or whatever. They are kind of like property. So they would follow your family for life. You may use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. So you can have a slave for life from another land, but you cannot do the same thing with Israelites. Let's look at the next verse just briefly. Just for context. Verse 47. Now, if the means of a stranger or a sojourner with you has become sufficient, and a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to himself that he sells himself to a stranger who was sojourning with you, or to the descendant of a stranger's family, then he shall have redemption right after he has been sold. So basically, this part goes and sets about how you would redeem that person in the year of Jubilee. In the year of Jubilee, he's to be set free anyway. Like in the year of Jubilee, which I think it was, I want to say the 7th year, every 7th year. Could be wrong. It talks about it in the beginning of Leviticus. But if a fellow Israelite goes into debt, he sells himself to slavery, basically, just to be consistent with the word, which the word, as you'll see in the next verses we look at, the word really just means servant. But if he sells himself, then he is by law able to redeem himself after a certain amount of time, or if he cannot, a fellow Israelite can come redeem him. And the interesting thing about that is he has that right by law. Like, so if a relative came over to redeem him, the person who the debt was owed to, the quote-unquote owner, he could not say no. He had to let him go. So that's pretty interesting. So anyway, let's get back to the video, and let's go back to the video, and so we can look at the next verse that he brings up. And then I'll address what the word of slave actually means. And we'll just talk about it some more.
6. However, you may purchase male and female slaves from among the foreigners who live among you. You may also purchase the children of such resident foreigners, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, pass them on to your children, and have a permanent inheritance. You may treat your slaves like this, but the people of Israel, your relatives, you must never treat this way. But how about what it says about your daughters? If a man sells his daughters as slaves, she will not be free to the end of 6 years as the men are. If she does not please the man who bought her, he may allow her to be bought back again. That's Exodus 21:7-11. Go look it up, people.
Alright, so let's go look at Exodus, and then I'll talk about a couple different things. Exodus. Alright, now, where does he start? He starts in verses 7. He starts in verse 7. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave. Let's start there. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she shall not go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eye of her master, and he designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he does not do these three things, then she go out for nothing, without payment or money. Now, let's go back and listen to what he read, and let's read this again, because there's a significant difference here. It still talks about slave. It says that these people, it talks about your right to have slaves. The women they cannot go free like the men can after 7 years. So, but that's interesting. Let's go back. I want to prove a point to y'all about this guy.
He may allow sells his daughters as slaves.
Right.
But how about what it says about your daughters? If a man sells his daughters as slaves, she will not be free to the end of 6 years as the men are. If she does not please the man who bought her, he may allow her to be bought back again. That's Exodus 21:7-11. Go look it up, people. The Bible is very...
Alright. Now, I'm going to read this again, and I want you to see, I'm going to explain the difference, but I want you to pick it up for yourself. There's something he left out. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, again, the father is selling her. It's not just, you're not stealing her from somebody. And then this is going to go into what a slave actually is. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eye of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall not have the authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Okay, so what you're seeing is a man selling his daughter as a slave. Now, she is not to go free. She is supposed to stay with whoever she is sold to. She is supposed to stay with that person for the rest of her life. What does that sound like? The woman stand with the man for her life. What does that sound like to you? If she is displeasing in the eye of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed, a.k.a. someone can free her. Someone can come and say, hey, you're unhappy with her, but I'll take care of her. I'll take her off your hands for you. So she can be redeemed, and she can be set free. He does not have the authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. It implies that by him trying to get rid of her, he's being unfair to her. Now, anyone who's ever been in an abusive relationship, because this is actually what this is. This person is called a slave, but if you look later on in verses 9, 10, and 11, on what he's obligated to do for her, she's not just a slave. Verse 8. Verse 8. If she is displeasing in the eye of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her go to be redeemed. He does not have the authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. Now, why would God not want her to be sold to a foreign people? Because this is Exodus 21. In Exodus 20 is the Ten Commandments. Let's go back. If my screen will work, it ain't working. Anyway, Exodus 20 is the Ten Commandments. Now, God just laid out how you're supposed to conduct yourself to each other, what you are to do, what you are not to do. You're supposed to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. What are the laws of the other people? It varies, but theoretically, if the people actually follow what God told them to do, any man that she went to would treat her properly and with respect. And this is what and then also, let's look at this, what he says in verse 9. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. Again, this is not just a slave. She may be called a slave, but she's pretty much, she's a wife. She's a wife. And, the idea is like, okay, she's a slave. The idea, the word slave is just like, bam, it's like right in your face. And it's like, it don't matter, she's still a slave. You know what I mean? She was sold as a slave. But guess what? What are arranged marriages? is when the parents arrange for the kids to be married. And there's usually a betrothal gift or like I think it's called a dowry gift that the man, one of the people, I'm not good on this, but basically there is a gift exchange of significant value in concert with the marriage, the arranged marriage. And this is just what you're seeing here is less of a more crude way of looking at it, but it's the same thing, really. She doesn't seem like she has a say in it, which is unfortunate. But this is the same thing as an arranged marriage. A man will sell his daughter, quote unquote, as a slave, but she's to stay with that man until she dies. Or a man can buy a woman as a slave for his son. Now, if he buys a female slave for his son, then he's supposed to treat her like a daughter. This is not a slave. This is not the slavery that you saw that we had in America. This is not the same thing. And it's unfortunate that the guy in the video, he leaves out all of this. Why doesn't he tell you about this? Why doesn't he say that this woman can be redeemed if the master is unhappy with her? And it implies in verse 8, he does not have the authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. It implies that by him being unhappy with her and wanting to get rid of her, that he's being unfair. But anyone who's been in an unhappy relationship, it is better for, in an abusive relationship, it is actually better for her to be redeemed than to stay with this guy that has contempt for her. It's much better for her to be with somebody else. So, let's say that happens. Now listen to this. Verse 10. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not produce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. So now listen to this. So in verse 8, a guy buys a female slave, aka he takes her as a wife. But just read it what it says. He's taking her as a wife. He can take her as a wife. If he's unhappy with her, he is free to let her go to someone else who will treat her right. If he decides, well, I don't want to let her go, and he grabs another wife, which we already know from what Jesus said and from what Genesis teaches, they really should only have one wife. But nobody seemed to listen to that. So now God made laws to govern them doing it. And, he didn't. It doesn't mean he approves of it. It means that, like Jesus said, but because of the hardness of our hearts, Moses allowed it. So God has given them commands.
Because of the hardening of their hearts, God did allow certain things to happen, just like he does today. He allows us to do good and to do bad, and he doesn't vanquish us at the moment that we have a terrible thought or a terrible deed. He gives us grace. He gives us grace and room to mess up, so to speak, and thankfully so.
He's giving them commands like, well, look, if y'all are already doing this, you're going to do it. I'm going to set some limits and some rules for how you still ought to conduct yourself. So now,
another example is when Israel asked for a king. They looked at the nations that were around them, and they had these iconic figures who would lead them into battle, and they had a source of or a point of pride, something to brag about or to exalt. And Israel didn't have anything. They had judges and they had various prophets, but they didn't have that icon. And they started demanding one. Look, we want to be like the nations around us. And that's how Israel got their first king in Saul. If you read in either 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel, and Samuel who was the prophet at the time, was greatly upset because it's like, well, God is leading you. God is your king. And then God told Samuel, don't be offended. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me, God. They're rejecting God. They would rather have a man leading them instead of God, just so they can feel better and exalt this man. Sound like something today? Certain religious institutions or certain churches and how they exalt particular men and they brag about their man, and they'll invite you to come to their services because of this man is so awesome. Not the power that's moving within them, but because of the man. But that's a whole nother story. But this, I just want to give you another example of that happening, where God was not happy with their decision to ask for a king, but He knew that they would. And it's interesting because if you read Deuteronomy, before they asked for a king, He gave them the laws, and He said, when you ask for a king, this is how the king is supposed to react. Now, at that time, they hadn't asked for a king at all. But He preemptively, He already knew that, and he laid down laws for it. Doesn't mean that He was happy with it, but He knew that's what would happen. So now where we at? So in verse 8, the master or the husband is unhappy with her. He keeps her for himself. He decides to grab another woman. And in verse 10, he can't produce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. He's still supposed to provide for her. And if he can't provide for her, she can leave free legally without him getting anything. So these people do have rights. This is not the slavery that we saw in the United States and other places. You compare this to what rights do the Africans have when they came here? They had nothing. We weren't even allowed to learn or read or anything. We didn't have any kind of rights. The women didn't have any kind of rights like this. They didn't have any rights. The slave masters here in the United States, they didn't. They didn't take care of them. They weren't obligated or required to take care of them. This is something totally different. Now, there's something else I want to point out. Why does he start in verse 7? If you look at Exodus 21 and you read from verse 1, that talks about slavery too. But he doesn't mention it. Why does he start in verse 7? Remember what I told y'all about reading in context. Let's start in verse 1 and look at it. Now, these are the ordinances which you are to set before them. This is God talking to Moses. If you buy, and these are the things that Moses is supposed to tell the people. Verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes along, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children may belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost. And his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. So, you got I don't know if it's the first earrings, but you see them incorporating earrings to designate or to identify ownership. Verse 2, if you own a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. So, is this the slavery that we saw in the United States? What does it sound more like? I'm going to show you what this is. By definition, it's an indentured servant. The person who is bound to work for another for a specified period of time, especially such as a person who came to America during the colonial period. So the biblical slavery that he's talking about is actually more in line with an indentured servant. Let's read it again if you don't believe so. And that's my whole point about the word slave. The word slave means servant. They're used interchangeably in the Bible. We're called slaves for Christ. Paul calls himself a slave for Christ. You're a slave to sin. It means servant. It means a servant. So, verse 2 again. Let's read it again. An indentured servant is what? Let's look at indentured servant again. A person who is bound to work for another for a specified period of time. That's an indentured servant. Now, if you think that, I'm going to read this again, and you tell me, what is that more like? American slavery or indentured servant? Verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. Meaning, you can't force him to redeem himself. By law, he's able to go free. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. He is the husband
then his wife shall go with him. So if a person sells himself into slavery due to finances, and he has a wife, you can't let him go and then keep his wife. You have to let her go with him. If his master gives him a wife, if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. So, if a person is single and he sells himself into slavery, and then you give him a wife from, I guess, one of your other servants, and because it wouldn't be wife, so somebody that I guess you're not sleeping with, because once you sleep with their wife. So if you give him a wife and they have kids, your kids are to stay behind. But if the slave plainly says, "I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man," then his master shall bring him to God. So then they'll have like a ceremony for him to officially say, like, "Well, I'm going to stay here because I don't want to leave my family." You don't have to agree with that. That sounds kind of sucky. I wouldn't like that. I wouldn't want to be in that situation. But it is what it is. That's what it says. It's still not the slavery, but it's still not the portrayal of what happened in our country. It is a person being an indentured servant and unfortunately not being able to take his children with him. You can agree with that. You can disagree with that. I don't really have an opinion. All I know is I wouldn't want it to happen to me, and I'm glad that I'm not in that situation. But anyway, but he doesn't mention that. My whole point is, if you look at the context, there's a lot that he's leaving out. Now, you still may say, "I don't care, it's a slave," or "they had slaves, so it's all the same, it doesn't matter." My whole point to y'all is not to say that this stuff doesn't happen. It does happen, but it's not what you think it is. That's my whole point, and I hope that anyone who's listening to this or watching this or whatever actually makes it this far, because no one can deny the atrocities that happen by so-called Christians in the early years, and even now in the name of Christianity, people like Creflo Dollar, like Benny Hinn, and those kind of people who abuse people's desire for God, I guess you could say, for their personal gain, and but the Bible talks about that kind of stuff. Like, it's not like the Bible tells you all throughout the New Testament to be on the lookout for these kind of people. They don't disqualify Christianity. Those people's presence are consistent with what the Bible teaches. So anyway, my point is, if you look at the context of this passage, you see that not only is there a limit to how long they can serve, which is only 6 years, compared to what in, Lord only knows how old some of those slaves were, still have to work. Like, that's insane. But a person that goes into debt, from what we saw in Leviticus, a person will go into debt, they'll sell himself into slavery, they shall serve for 6 years. And on the 7th year he shall be set free without having to pay for his freedom. That's not what you see in the United States. And he intentionally does not include this because he's trying to paint you a picture. He's not giving you a fair, unbiased opinion on, look, Christianity is, I really think this is something wrong. That's not his mentality, and that's not his, I don't even know how to say it. That's not the era that he has about when he talks. It's one of hostility and anger towards the Bible itself. He's not sharing you with this because he cares about black people so much. And I'm not saying that he doesn't care about black people, but look, his intent is just to discredit the Bible. He calls it a book of fairy tales and that sort of thing. So, anytime you listen to someone who talks like that, you have to be careful. You have to go back and read what they say, because they're not going to give you a fair representation of what they're attacking. going to give you bits and pieces, and I mean, you may still disagree. You still may think the Bible, whatever. You're entitled to your opinion. But I just want anyone who's listening and watching to fully understand what's being presented to you and understand that it is a straw man, which is a straw man is a fake representation of a particular position or stance. And what they'll do is, instead of someone fighting you, they'll make a fake you and then beat up the fake you like a dummy. And beat up the dummy for everyone to see and say, look, I just kicked that person's butt. No, you didn't. You created a fake enemy and destroyed the fake enemy. And that's what he's doing. It's called a straw man argument. He's not presenting to you he's not presenting quote unquote slavery to you as it's presented in the Bible. He's giving you bits and pieces of it, the parts that he thinks is consistent with American slavery. Again, read it yourself. Exodus 21. Read the whole chapter. Don't just read a verse here or there. If you read all of this and you still agree with him, fine. You have every right to. But
all right, there's something I want to add to this. And let's go to Exodus 21. There's something else I want to show you too that he conveniently forgot to mention in his video. All right, Exodus 21. Now, this is Exodus 21. He stopped at 9. No, he stopped at, I don't know where he stopped. If a man sells his daughter, verse 7, she's not free to go. Verse 8. He didn't mention verse 9, or if he did, he didn't go any further. Let's look at verse 12. Let's go a little further. He who strikes a man so that he dies surely shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint you a place to where he may flee. If, however, a man acts presumptuously toward his neighbor, and so to kill him craftily, you are to take him even from my altar, that he may die. So even if he's in church. But basically what that means is, if in a crime of passion, if a man, they argue or something like that, or, and he gives into his anger and he kills the man, he can flee. He can go to a city of asylum or whatever. You are not to kill him. But if it's premeditated, automatic death penalty. Now, I'm not saying that that's what should be done today. I'm not saying that it should or it shouldn't. I'm just saying this is what this says. 15, if he strikes his mother or his father, put him to death. And look at 16. He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. So, you telling me that this is the slavery, this is the Bible that gave the people back in the day freedom for slavery? The one that says, number 12, let's look at another, we're going to look down a little more too. But if anyone kills another man intentionally, he deserves the death penalty. Verse 16, anyone that kidnaps a man, death penalty. Let's look at where is it at? Verse 26. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. Now, again, I don't really know how many times I can say it. Slave means servant. It just means servant. It's just another word for it. It's even though I believe that, the idea of hearing the word, I automatically myself think of, what happened here in this country. So it's definitely a stumbling block, and I don't blame anyone who can't get over the word, but at least understand what it's talking about. If you can't get over the word, but just look at the type of quote unquote slavery that you're seeing, and you ask yourself, is what you're reading here in the Bible, is it what happened in this country? Even the conditions around the beginning of it is completely wrong, according to what we just read. And then the intention of it here in the scripture is so that there's no home. They didn't have any homeless. If they followed this to the T, there was not one homeless person. There was no welfare system to where people were not contributing anything. They were just taking. The people that were down and out, they were to receive assistance, aka welfare, temporarily. And when they got back on their feet, they had to pay back whatever that they got. So that's a healthy system. That's a healthy system. Today, people that are on welfare now, and I'm not anti-welfare, but they don't have to pay back anything. They just take and take and take. And some people it helps, some people abuse it. But my whole point is, you look at this structure of quote unquote slavery, which is really hiring yourself out to work. And there's rules for you to be respected and treated like a human being. So for him, he wants to compare this to what happened in our country. No, he conveniently will not show you verses like verse 26. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let them go free. But you want to compare that to what happened in this country, or the women. And the thing about the women not being able to be free after 6 years, the men, they're going to have sex with her. Therefore, that makes them her wife. That makes them his wife. They may not call it that. They may call it concubine or whatever. But the idea is that she would not be used and abused and then left out to hang, just sent out, kicked out to where she's homeless, and then she's being used and abused as a way to make it from day to day. No. These women, if the instructions were followed properly, every woman should have a man, either a husband or a quote-unquote master, taking care of them. Now just think about today. Again, I mentioned it earlier, but what happens today? And women still do not have the equal rights that they should. But if you look at even a woman today that's 16, 17, 18, if they decide I'm growing, I'm going to be out there on my own, do you know what's going to happen to her? Talk to anyone who's made that decision or who knows someone that made that decision. And sometimes it may work out. But a lot of times, where do they end up? Dead or being used as toys, sex slaves, or that sort of thing. So in this system, there is no person, male or female, who ought to not be accounted for. That if someone was coming along to try to take advantage of them, there's always at least one person that they would have to answer to. Each person is given at least a very basic value. Maybe not the rights. The slaves don't have the same rights as the family, but they're part of the family. They're considered part of the family. And again, they're not just like how it is today, a homeless person that someone can just kill or kidnap, and then there's no one there's no next of kin. There's nobody accountable for this person or responsible for this person. And as you read along, you'll see, what happens if your slave does something or your servant does something. And this is just part one. I mean, there's more to the video. I apologize for this being so long. I apologize for me stammering and stuttering over my words. I am not the most eloquent speaker. But if you watch this far, to watch all of this and to stare at these words on the screen for all this time, you have my greatest appreciation. And I pray that you think about, watch it again, fast forward, listen to only certain parts if you want to, and just understand what the Bible is really saying. The Bible is not a book. Again, you shouldn't do it with any type of literature at all, unless it's like a comic book. And even then, you don't, like how many times have you turned on a TV show in the middle and you don't know what's going on? You may figure out some of it, but you're like, well, what happened? I missed the beginning. You will never miss the beginning of your favorite show, Scandal or Empire. You got to see the whole thing from beginning to end so you can understand all of it. How much more so literature, where there are no visual cues. You don't read literature by one ripping a phrase out. You don't do that. I don't understand why people do that with the Bible. I don't understand why people do that with the law, the Constitution, everything. That's just poor reading comprehension. It's just a bad practice. So if you disagree, please reply and be specific in your reply, and we can have a healthy, mature discussion about it. You don't have to agree with me. you can think this is all baloney. But break it down to me, explain to me why. You know what I mean? So, Tony, thanks for posting that video. It was very interesting. And brother, I hope you listen to this. And, I have a challenge for the other Christians. Why is no one replying to this video? You don't necessarily have to. And there, you could be quick, you can be quick to quote a passage that talk about not arguing and that sort of thing. I'm not arguing with that guy. I'm replying to it because I don't want to see anyone stumble by someone who's quoting manipulated scriptures and misinforming people. That kind of stuff bothers me. It's funny, don't be quick to say like, oh, there should not be strife or anything like that. But then as soon as somebody say something about your kid, you're ready to go out on the street with a machete. That's how y'all be. So don't be like that, and don't be a coward. If you believe something, stand up for it. Don't be a little sissy and a coward, but then go to church every Sunday talking about you serve the Lord. And that's all I got to say.